This is the video for the Try It section of Lesson 15, Programming Pivot Tables and Pivot Charts. For this lesson, you create a pivot chart that is going to accompany an existing pivot table on your worksheet. The pivot table is here, and its source data is this list right here. It's already put together. And what you want to do is to add a pivot chart that will occupy this area roughly right around here below the pivot table. To do that, you will write a macro that will first, of course, require that you go to the Visual Basic Editor, Alt F11 from any version of Excel, or from the ribbon you can click the Developer tab and the Visual Basic icon. You'll notice that I've already got a module in this workbook, and in it I have the entire code that created the pivot table that you saw in that worksheet a moment ago. So here is this entire macro that created the pivot table that you saw. I wanted to include that, and we could have this macro that we are about to write that will create the chart for this pivot table. We could have it in the same module, but I'm going to put it in its own module. Insert module is by now what you know to do to create a new module. And we're going to name this new macro Create Pivot Chart. One of the first habits that you will find yourself getting into when you know that you're going to be manipulating objects such as pivot tables, charts, you're going to be selecting perhaps rows, columns, you're going to be adding or deleting rows, adding new worksheets, etc. When you do that, behind the scenes, the VBA code is going to cause the window to refresh itself when every object is hidden, unhidden, activated, selected, etc. And you want to help your macro to run faster by not refreshing the screen as those objects are manipulated in your code. And to do that, you will enter in this line of code that by now you've seen a few times, but you'll want to remember, and if you forget, you'll know when you run the code that you'll see a lot of flickering on your screen and that you should have done this. Application.screenUpdating equals false. I've just selected it right now. I'm going to hit the Control-C keys to copy it, and arrow down here to paste it, and I'm backspacing here to replace the false with true to set screen updating back to true, which is always what you want to do. You want to have screen updating set to false at the beginning of a macro when you're manipulating objects, and you want to set it back to true at the end of the macro. We are going to be creating a chart that will be representing the data in a pivot table. When you do that, a good rule of thumb is to declare an object variable for the pivot table that you're going to be drawing the data off of. It will make things easier in your code to write after that. So we're just going to declare a variable obj_pt as pivot table. And because it's an object variable, the next line of code will be to set obj_pt, that's that pivot table, equals active sheet dot pivot tables with the index number of 1. Now I have active sheet on here because you need to qualify for VBA which parent worksheet this pivot table you're interested in is on. It happens to be the active worksheet that we're currently on. Had it not been that way, we would have had to say worksheets sheet 2 or sheet 3 or whatever the worksheet is that is the parent sheet that the pivot table of interest is located on. And the number 1 is here because it's the index 1 of the pivot tables that is on this active sheet. We know that there's only one pivot table on that sheet, so the index number must be 1. And therefore you're safe saying that it's the index number 1 of the pivot table that this chart will be drawn from. The best way that I recommend setting a chart to a pivot table is to do something that goes against the grain of what you have been hearing quite a bit in videos and in your VBA code writing travels, is that you want to avoid activating or selecting objects. We talked in the previous video for the lesson 14 when it was about creating a chart that there are some cases that you will want to actually select an object, and not only will you want to, sometimes you will have to. And I'm going to select this pivot table. You technically don't have to do that to accomplish what we're going to do, but it makes the code a lot easier in the long run. You're not really adding a lot of overhead. If you keep your activating and selecting to a minimum in your code writing practices, as we're doing in this case, selecting and activating sometimes has a more positive effect. And so that is why after I have done that, I could say charts.add, because now the chart that just got added knows that its data to represent will be whatever object was selected immediately before it was added. And so now you have this chart in memory that knows it belongs to the pivot table. And that has cut down the amount of code now that I'll need to write. What's only left after this is to tell VBA where to place this chart. I can safely write active chart because now I know the chart is active because it just got added. You might have noticed that when you add a worksheet in VBA code, at the moment you do that, the worksheet you added is the active worksheet. Same as when you add a chart, the chart that you add is the active chart. So you do need to tell VBA what the location is of this chart that you just added. And where you are going to place it is first by entering the where keyword. You need to do that. And you'll see that IntelliSense pops up one of three options. And the option in this case that we're interested in, because we are going to place it on the current worksheet, is Excel location as object. Now that's fine, except that you still need to tell VBA what the name of that parent object is. And I'm going to enter in a comma and space. This is the syntax for the where argument for the location of the chart. And for readability's sake, I'm going to enter in this line continuation character and resume on the next line. You're going to place this on the same worksheet as the existing pivot table. Now, how do you tell VBA that? You tell it by saying name, and it looks like you're going to be naming the chart, but you're not. You're going to be specifying the name of the worksheet, equals the same name as, and this is where the variable comes in handy that you declared, dot parent, that is the worksheet, dot name. So oftentimes one of the jokes in VBA code is that you can read it from right to left, and it makes more sense than if you read it from left to right. The name of the parent object of the pivot table is where this active chart is going to be located, and the parent object name is, in this case, sheet 1. Now that you've just told VBA which worksheet to place the chart, you're going to want to tell it exactly where on that sheet you want to put it, and it's going to be in cell H23. We're going to put the upper left corner of the chart in cell H23. And while we're doing that, I'm going to go back to the worksheet for a moment. Is that we said we're going to place that chart below the existing pivot table. And adding a few extra rows here to remain empty, we're going to place the upper left corner of the chart right here in cell H23. And how to do that is we will go back to the Visual Basic Editor and enter in a line of code that, and I'm going to type this in very quickly, that the active chart dot parent, which is going to be the cell, dot left is what the left edge of range H23 is. And in the same way, we will need to tell it what the top edge is, and that defines the top left corner by saying the same thing as we said up here, except that now it's going to be top instead of left. And the only other remaining item to take care of is what I stressed if you had a chance to watch the video for lesson 14, when you work with these objects on worksheets, these embedded objects like pivot tables and charts especially, be sure you remember to deselect the object itself. And the best way to do that is to select a cell. And range A1 is a very good candidate because we're going to be up in that area of the worksheet anyways. And selecting a cell is by definition deselecting any object that might have been selected at that moment. And that is the code that creates the chart from a pivot table and places it on the same worksheet as the pivot table from which it was created, and locates that pivot chart where you want it to go. I'm going to press the Alt Q keys to go back to the worksheet, and I'm going to maybe click some other cell just to clear out this area here and come over here to my macros icon. And here are our two macros here in the macro dialog box. One of them I showed you had already been existing. That's the one that created this pivot table here. And now I'm going to select the create pivot chart that we just wrote the code for and click the run button. And there is the pivot chart that is created for this pivot table. And as you may know, you can manipulate pivot charts just as you can pivot tables with these drop down buttons. It's a pivot chart, and X, just like any pivot chart would, we created it in code and we located it where we wanted it off of an existing pivot table.